Okay, Chris, thank you very much for that introduction to warring fictions. Can I just ask you to give some quick examples for balance, if you like, from the right wing and from what's been happening over the past few years, where it seems to me that quite a lot of people in the Conservative Party and some of the populist movements have fallen into the same kinds of traps. They can see conspiracies in Brussels. They see the President of the European Union as a dark knight. There was a golden era before Britain went in, when we were free to make all our laws, etc., even though we were paying off most of our debt to the United States from the Second World War. Just how much have you observed this point of view being common across the political spectrum?
I think it's absolutely common across the political spectrum, and I think that the Nigel Farage, Boris Johnson, Dominic Cummings, Donald Trump in America, they've all bought into these ways of describing the world based on a kind of enemies within, based on this very, very cherry-picked version of the past, which is almost the kind of inversion of the Labour cherry-picked version of the past. And I think it's exactly the same thing has happened. It's almost a mirror image, and part of the reason that the two-party system has really struggled to deal with it in the way that it has, and it's always been a race between the two, Labour and the Conservatives, as to who's going to split first because of this thing. It's because these populist impulses within the two parties were completely unsustainable, and I think that's where the real the real parallel is there. And I think there's one key difference, which is actually that the populist right, to put it bluntly, are a lot better at it than the populist left. They're pretty effective populists. They're good at cutting into the kind of visceral narratives of us and them. They're better at blaming elites, be it the liberal metropolitan elite or the liberal press, as they talk about in America. They're better at kind of conjuring up a vision of the past, and that appeal is more primal and effective. So ultimately, I think left populism not only is counterproductive and sometimes reactionary in a number of the ways that we've just talked about, but is actually it generally invariably loses to right populism. And
there's an interesting reflection on how the parties seem to have moved away from the centre and the ability to fight against that. I mean, people are reminded that Enoch Powell made his speech about rivers of blood on a Wednesday or a Thursday in Birmingham, and by the following week he was out. The Conservative Party had thrown him out, and the Labour Party had agreed with it, and it was all over. And that was partly because, even though he did it in Latin and it had to be spelled out to a lot of people, the underlying racism, all of that generation knew where it led to, and so he was gone very quickly. Is there something missing in that experience of the importance of pluralism, the importance of fighting back against these myths, that somehow we have not enough experience in them in this generation?
That's interesting. I think I haven't thought about it in that way before, actually, but I think that is quite a lot of truth in it, in that there has been a period of relative peace in the UK there had been for quite a long time, and a relative prosperity, and in some ways these the danger of these myths, particularly if you look at the anti-Semitism within Labour, for instance, we've sort of forgotten quite how dangerous some of these ideas can be once you really say these guys are the bad people. So I agree with you, really.
And lastly, there was a very funny episode when you presented this in Westminster, when a woman in her 70s put her hand up and said that you just described the Socialist Workers' Party training book that she'd been given in the 1970s, how to basically paint everybody as a dark knight. Do you think there's some truth in that some of the left-wing factions have fallen into that, always slicing one step beyond, never good enough, differentiating?
Yeah.
That's become a destructive policy?
Yeah, completely. I think these traits were inherent on the far, or the kind of very hard left, the SWP, and these kind of, and it's a well-known trope and joke about the left is of the People's Front of Judea and Labour splitting and things like this, and I think that they were embedded quite deeply within some of those areas on the far left, but then the kind of rise of populism in the last 10 years and the rise of social media that came with it has sort of doused paraffin almost on that and meant that it kind of caught light and spread into other areas where previously it was kind of a real bit of a no-no, basically.
Yeah. And we're recording this in Croydon at a time when the Labour Party's really trying to resurrect itself in the north. And people would say that a sort of large white Croydon resident like myself couldn't possibly represent the Labour Party. Are we beginning to see all sorts of inverted ideas coming out that can be in the centre of the party as well as at the left and right? That it must be a woman, that it has to be somebody from the north. Are these just further developments of that there's a fix for this kind of thing?
I'm not sure if those things necessarily fit into these myths completely. I think things like the needing to be a woman is not necessarily a completely either or dark night binary necessarily. I think that there has been the fact that Labour has never had a woman leader is genuinely a kind of very big issue. But I do think some of the culture wars stuff, that when you think about some of those seats that Labour have lost and some of the kind of the real culture war elements of arguments about whether Winston Churchill was evil, which was a Paul Mason writing articles about how evil and racist and bad Winston Churchill was, is a classic Dark Knight thing, because you can take Winston Churchill and say this is a guy's a product of his era, and he had horrendous traits and ultimately did also beat fascism, or you can say, right, he's one of the bad guys, and choosing to pick culture war fights over some of these issues, I think is completely counterproductive to a lot of the seats that Labour needs to win back.
And we Scots remember when he was a Liberal MP in Dundee. Questions from the audience to Chris? We've got a handheld mic. Can you just say who you are and where you're from?
Hi, I'm Matthew Hill. I'm a chair of a local CLP in Croydon. Thank you for that. That's brilliant. I'm really enlightening, and I love the way that you've kind of you've tied everything together in a very clear way in terms of the three myths. Just with respect to talking about some of the things that you've brought up, particularly conspiracy theories and why people are led to conspiracy theories. I'm dismayed as you are by conspiracy theories. I think particularly seeing what's happening right now with the BBC and the fact that it's now people both on the far left and the far right who are actually trying to undermine the BBC, and we should actually be dismayed at what's happening in terms of the government looking in towards trying to destroy the BBC's charter. And actually there's a lot of people on the far left saying, oh, we don't care, because the BBC were against us. But just in terms of how people get to these conspiracy theories, I think a lot of it's to do with the marginalisation. And going back to what you were saying about interconnectedness, so although actually, as you say, there's been great progress in terms of reducing poverty over the last a few decades, despite Thatcherism, I think because of the interconnectedness and particularly the rise of social media, there's a lot more kind of reduction in self-esteem. I think self-esteem is really a core issue here, and I think people are turning to conspiracy theories and blaming various other groups that they don't belong to, particularly along racial and nationalist lines, because that's the only way that they can feel better about themselves, and that's in turn why they turn to conspiracy theories. And I'm just thinking about, what would you suggest in terms of how you tackle that kind of, you know, the kind of route, which as I see it, you may disagree, but the route as I see it in terms of why people do turn to conspiracy theories and then blaming people and then gravitate towards the far left or far right conspiracy theories. Because I really do think kind of social mobility, increasing education, creating a society in which we all have the you know, similar education levels is really the only way we can overcome that. But I'm interested to hear what you have to say on that.
Yes. I think a big part of that does have to come from politicians and people within politics being a bit more honest about the hard choices on offer on some of these questions. Although I've sort of was kind of defending politicians quite a lot in that speech, in that talk, I do think that it's there has to be, you know, being hard-headedly talking about the pros and cons of a certain eventuality is what I think quite a lot of the public are looking for in terms of leadership, and they're quite willing to accept the cons or the drawbacks if those choices are honestly presented. And I think that's quite similar to what you're saying in a way, because it's about not political education, but political clarity about the real choices on offer. But I think a lot of the conspiracy theories, and certainly the softer end of conspiracy theories, of the idea that I was talking about, of the power being infinite, and you go into 10 Downing Street and you make it rain, hasn't been helped by people not presenting those hard choices. You can understand why they don't present those hard choices, but I think talking a little bit more honestly actually on some of these either or things would help that, because I do agree with you about it being a sense of agency, and things like, you know, the David Cameron tens of thousands number about immigration, for instance. I think if his approach had been to say we can't tackle immigration without very major drawbacks in other aspects of our life, that would potentially be more successful than creating a total hostage to fortune, which led to this really dramatic shift to the right a few years afterwards.
Hi, I'm Stella. I'm Secretary, Croydon South. My question, I was debating on whether to ask you, but I will. Looking at the leadership contestants, do you think anybody gets what you're trying to say?
I definitely. That's quite a. Yeah, honestly speaking, I thought Jess Phillips was possibly one of the strongest candidates in terms of really calling out some of these myths and talking about how counterproductive it was for us to be, you know, banging on about how much we hated the Conservatives the whole time, or not presenting honest choices. And I thought she was quite an important voice in that she was very clearly from the left of the Labour Party, but had not gone down this slippery slope of populist narratives. I think she was quite and remains a really important voice in it. And then I do think that the other candidates, certainly Lisa Nandy and Keir Starmer, are in their different ways not people who are buying into these narratives. The difficulty is they are running a leadership campaign with this electorate, and they're where these narratives are very strong among parts of that electorate, and that's the difficulty, I suppose. Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting that what you describe is how these narratives can take off on the left and right when the populist begins to feel more and more insecure. I mean, you know, the votes were only lost 52-48, but it was like a tipping point. And interestingly, in the last Parliament before 2015, Ed Miliband identified the squeezed middle, the rising insecurity, and people talk about that in the United States as well, but didn't manage to find a narrative that would drive them forward. If you compare that with Wilson in the 60s, where he was able to tap into aspiration by just saying that he would get the right to go to university up from 6 or 7% to maybe 10%, and that gave people hope. Have they lost the ability to write the counter narratives that are aspirational enough to grab people's imagination, even though by any measure of reality, compared to the 50% that are going to university now, that was a very low threshold, but people had a sense of going forward. How do you counter these myths? Is there without having a white knight, is there a mechanism, or is it sort of Monty Python ridiculing them until they fall to bits in their own absurdity?
I think I don't think there's an easy answer to it. Like, I wish that there was a sort of, some single 5-line slogan that was a sort of take back control type thing for the pluralist left. But I don't think there is that necessarily. I think questioning these assumptions all the time is really important. And I think, and I do think thinking about some of the things that are really positive in the modern world and being able to make that case for those things is really important, and really saying to people that there is a better way. Not everything is awful. But I also think part of the reason that this impasse has come about is actually because there isn't necessarily a clear route into the future, because of the interconnectedness stuff that I was sort of touched on a little bit. There isn't an absolute. I think that some of the solutions will need to be things like sort of EU-wide policies on tax avoidance, or rates of corporation tax, or regulation of kind of big business. And we need really quite big supranatural international policies to address some of this stuff. And that is obviously, it's a very hard time to try and make that pitch. So because these questions are particularly hard, even potentially compared to in the Harold Wilson period, the temptation of the easy answers becomes so much greater. So I think it's some really hard thinking about actually what is the solution to this, that can make people feel that there is a path into the future that is valuable and positive. And
okay. Richard?
Thanks. I was just going to follow up on the thing you said about increasing the percentage of people going to university. If you increase it from 6 to 9, then people presumably feel better. But it's a bit like if you increase the money supply by a few percent, then everyone feels prosperous. But if you increase it drastically, then you have hyperinflation. And it could be argued that Blair's increase of the percentage going to university has caused its devalued degrees and increased student debt, basically. So it's not really open to us anymore, Yeah.
Well, people lose a sense of progress. That's exactly right. Richard?
Thank you, Chris. I wanted to come back on a couple of points because I thought you covered things very strongly, but there was a few things that I wanted to add. I think this bit, and our friend made a point earlier, that kind of why has this come about? And I think it was the sense that Corbynism and those 3 myths you talk about are incredibly empowering for the person at the other end of them, and this sense that we can overcome evil, that we can that there can be a better tomorrow. They're saying because it's happened before, we can therefore do it again, and that the reason why conspiracy theorism is so attractive to people is because it's very empowering. You can see behind the curtain, and the Wizard of Oz is there pulling the strings, and and the thing about it is you're one of the very few that gets to have that insight. So it's incredibly empowering for people, and I think that we have to keep that in mind, those who are fighting pluralism, is that's what we're up against, because the danger is, and I think why some of us that have been part of trying to resist this have failed is that we have almost played down, one, people's need to feel empowered, or two, not recognised it as them being empowered, because those of us who've been looking on at it have often seen it as ridiculous or difficult or just so fundamentally wrong that we've belittled but the need to empower, let alone the fact they're being empowered. The second point I wanted to make was all three of those myths are very closely followed by anti-Semitism. Actually, all of them. Not you've picked up one or two at different times, but all three of them are the environment of which anti-Semitism follows very quickly. And I think that the Labour Party, when it has a new leader, will answer a very fundamental question: can you have Corbynism without anti-Semitism? And I think that's going to be profound. And I fear you can't, because essentially, if your thesis is right, this is not really about what policies you hold, but what position you hold in propagating these three myths. Then the anti-Semitism will always follow very closely, because it's never in the interest of the person who propagates this myth to actually draw a line and say, no, it doesn't apply in this instance. Because the minute you do that, the whole myth breaks down. It's why Corbyn is totally unable, even if you believe he's not an anti-Semite, which I don't, but even if you do, he can't act, because by pulling down even a bit of the myth or saying the myth has a boundary, you completely floor the myth existing. The third thing, and this is even more unpopular a position, I think, than the last one that I just shared, is that I think we have to ask how these came about. And my unpopular thesis is that the Dark Knight theory in the party, also my point, these three didn't come about together. They've been slippery, with a slippery slope. So broadly, when Gordon followed Tony, he needed an analysis that said that even if the Blairites were right, they were wrong to be right, and therefore their analysis could be thrown down. So he developed the Dark Knight theory as a part of his leadership to bring about his control in the party. Because even if James Pennell was right about something going wrong, James Pennell's a bad person, a right-wing person, therefore he could be dismissed. And that idea was propagated then. Then Ed Miliband comes in with a golden era idea that there were Labour governments who were good, but the last one just wasn't one of them, and therefore we must kind of go to that. And then Corbyn ultimately just added the third one of the puppet master. And so had all three of them have been hit by this left populism in one go, it may have been able to be resisted. But people who know better actually gave in to those tenets of populism early, and therefore when you just add in the puppet master as this great empowering exercise at the end, it actually meant that we were very unable to fight Corbynism when we were met with all three of those and the full weight of what came afterwards. Thank you.
A really, really interesting question. The particularly, I think the first one really gets to the core of why this is so challenging, is because it's, I think the danger of expelling these myths completely is it's almost a technocracy, a sort of, I think in fact that was the word that Ed Miliband used a lot about New Labour, and with some justification, I think. And so thinking about, and I've thought about this, and I tried to think about it towards the end of the book, the actual existential questions that these myths throw up are quite deep questions of, what do you do if you don't have the baddies to fight against? It becomes quite difficult, because it's questions about what's if power is so if power is so hard, it becomes less easy to criticise governments for doing the wrong thing, because you get into this very technical thing of like, there's lots of brakes on their power and lots of things that they're juggling, and then it becomes almost a bit of an end of politics thing. So I think we need to. The problem is that these myths have come to consume Labour in such a way that they almost the party stands for very little beside the three myths. But I think you have to accept them as to a degree a fact of life, but we have to drive them back if we can't drive them out, because the position we've got to is so dire. But I think thinking quite seriously about how we can, whether it's possible to live without these myths, not to get too deep, is quite important. And on the anti-Semitism point, I just couldn't agree completely. And I think it was, that's why it's been this massive one step forward, 2 step back process on it. Is though, even though I think the Corbynites in many cases sincerely want to drive out anti-Semitism and certainly wish this problem wasn't there, with the next breath they're talking about the rigged system and the manufactured consent and the deep state. So how can that automatically leads towards someone to go, well, who is running the deep state? And then finally, definitely with I think the use of these narratives does certainly predate Jeremy Corbyn's rise within the party. There was a good article I read by, I think it was Hoppy Sen, about one stepping, about how you pretend that you're like just a little bit more, and it's a small tactic to say you're not really one of us, and then before you know it, you've suddenly you've joined the out group, and it leads to completely ridiculous farce, because Gordon Brown was trying to create an out group which was the Blairites, who are the right wingers, and then he became part of the out group, and now then it moves to the point where Owen Jones is part of the out group because he says one negative thing about Corbyn, and it's completely inexorable. It leads nowhere, because it's entirely about the positions in relation to other stuff.
Okay, I think we'll begin to wind it up there. I think it's very interesting questions. I'll just say and leave it hanging in there that I could apply quite a lot of this analogies to Scotland and the rise of nationalism and populism there, although it's done with quite a social democratic face at the moment. Those of you that are not following things in Scotland at the moment, it's now becoming harder and harder going down the road of these myths and betrayals and dark nights, and I think it'll be quite interesting to see where some of that goes and whether an effective narrative can be created against it, because that's really what some of these leadership moments are about. Can anybody show the sign that they can develop narratives that can counter these myths and keep them in check, even if it's a continuous battle? Can I ask everybody to join me in thanking Chris for a really great presentation and wish him luck with his book. Thank you very much.